Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and thank you for joining us in the first episode of The Way Forward. This is a new initiative that we at The Atlantic are hosting with our partners in this, Chatham House, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Emerson Collective, which is also the majority owner of The Atlantic, the magazine I edit. We hope that this partnership will contribute something to the global discussion about where we are and some of the challenges that lie ahead. Just a quick note, we're going to take some questions, so please ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to incorporate them. This is going to be a little bit of coronavirus speed dating that we got going on here. We have a bunch of very, very interesting people to talk to in the next hour. So keep your questions short. We won't get to all of them, but keep them short and on topic, and we'll try to incorporate them into the conversation. And also in your question, tell us where you're writing from. We have a lot to discuss. So I want to just jump right in, and I want to welcome first Gordon Brown, of course, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and now the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education. Prime Minister, are you there? Yes, you are.
Yes, indeed.
Welcome, welcome. We are so technologically adept; it's unbelievable. Thank you for joining us. Let me just ask you very, very specifically. I think that the framing of this question is the frame that many billions of people have around the world, which is what do you envision right now to be the clearest pathway forward out of the mess we're in? And you could break that question into two parts: the US, UK, Europe, developed countries, and then I know you've been speaking a lot about issues facing developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. So if you can take those in two, please do.
Well, in sync with the mission of Chatham House, Emerson, Atlantic, and Peterson, I think my theme is that global problems require global solutions. And I would say that such is the mismatch between the boldness of national economic measures and the frugality and feebleness of the global measures that have been taken to deal with this crisis, that we're actually acting as if we've got one hand tied behind our back. We cannot genuinely say at the moment we're doing whatever it takes to solve this health and economic crisis. All we can say is that as individual governments lacking global coordination, we're doing the best we can. And it does remind me of the 1930s and of protectionism and of the lack of leadership then. Churchill said that leaders were resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful for impotence. And Keynes went on to say that politics in his generation was the survival of the unfittest. So we have a real problem, I think, about the lack of global coordination, which is going to prolong this crisis. It may mean that this crisis cannot end properly. It certainly means we cannot fully eradicate the disease that we're facing without coordination. Now,
so are you talking about increased globalization? Because that's not exactly the drift of events in recent years and certainly recent days.
I would say there are two urgent challenges that we've got to realize we face together. The first is the health challenge, and there cannot be a proper exit strategy without global cooperation. Let me just illustrate this. The search for a vaccine has got to be funded. Now, it may come out of one country, out of one inventor, out of one company. But that's not enough. It's got to be scaled up, developed, mass manufactured, equally distributed. It's got to be available in every continent. And that requires a level of global cooperation and a sharing of resources and a funding of the poorer countries that is simply not there at the moment. Take the other issue that we're facing at the moment, capacity in testing equipment, ventilators, personal protective health equipment. We're competing with each other for a very limited share of capacity when this is a synchronized crisis and we are needing the same equipment simultaneously almost everywhere. What we should be doing is building up by a coordinated plan the global capacity to have the testing equipment, to have all the medical equipment we need. And instead of fighting each other, we should be concentrating on building capacity. Right. And then take the third problem, which again requires global cooperation. And we've really got to think of this as a practical answer to a practical problem, not some abstract debate between globalists and nationalists. if we are to prevent a second and third and fourth wave of this virus coming into the countries that are now experiencing it, we have got to help the underdeveloped health systems of the world cope. We've got to help those countries that have got no social safety nets and can't practice stay-at-home policies, social distancing, not even hand washing in some cases where water and sanitation is so poor. Now, if we do not help these countries, then they will be carriers of this disease back into our own countries. And so the measures that have been announced at the moment are so inadequate to deal with what is probably a 2.5 trillion requirement. Debt relief, 15 billion out of 2.5 trillion. IMF and World Bank resources, it's not the heads of these institutions, they're doing the best. The shareholders have not released what should be around 1 trillion of resources to the IMF and World Bank. And then, of course, special drawing rights, the creation of new international money. So in each case, there is no proper exit strategy without global cooperation. And the global cooperation we need has got to recognize both the flaws in previous attempts at cooperation and the opportunities that now exist. You've got medical, scientific, research cooperation across continents, but we don't have the intergovernmental cooperation that can fund that effort and can back it up.
Let me ask you this, is the problem, is a core problem we're facing today that this problem that we're facing, the global pandemic, is simply too large to get our hands around? Or are we facing a crisis of bad leadership?
No, we could go to the moon, and we were able to abolish a whole series of
We'll talk about the leadership question.
Diseases. And so this is a question of willpower. And if you look at it this way, what are the ways we've chosen to try and organize this world to deal with problems like this in the past? Now, whether it's dealing with pandemics or climate change or nuclear proliferation or inequality and sustainable development goals and so on and so forth, we've tried through the principles that govern the Washington Consensus. That is a neoliberal sort of economic management that is applied to just about every country. Now, the Washington Consensus is not even supported in Washington anymore, as you know. Then we've tried with America first, India first, China first. That's roughly where we are at the moment. Russia first, every country for themselves. But you know perfectly well, that cannot solve a pandemic. That can't deal with climate change. That can't deal with inequality when you're dealing with tax havens, for example. It can't deal with nuclear proliferation. Then people say, well, it's China and the USA, one world, two systems. But you know perfectly well that just as in the Cold War, the countries will operate according to what is their vested interest and perhaps ignore all these global problems. We have got to find a way of practical, day-to-day, if you like, issue-to-issue cooperation so that we can actually deal with problems as they exist. We've got a medical problem that is global and can't be solved without global action. We've got an economic problem that is as big as the 1930s, as sudden as any crisis that has hit us, more casualties than often in many wars. And we, even with a 15 trillion stimulus, because there is a lack of global coordination, even when you add up this attempt at underpinning the world economy, it is not going to be enough. And we face a decade and perhaps more of secular stagnation. Larry Summers' phrase, a 1930s phrase, coming back to us if we do not find a way of cooperating together. You need a coordinated fiscal, monetary, central bank stimulus. We are at stage 1 of this crisis, dealing with employment protection. Stage 2 will be getting the economies back to growth, and that will need coordinated action.
Let me ask you, before we go to 1 or 2 questions from our audience, let me ask you one other thing on this leadership question. And pardon me if it sounds parochial, I am sitting in Washington, but is what we're dealing with here a crisis of American leadership? The world has become accustomed, for better and sometimes worse, but often better, since the close of World War II, the notion that the president of the United States will somehow organize the world community to a collective response to a problem. President Obama did this most recently with Ebola.
I don't think anybody doubts that globalization is leaderless at the moment. And you can see that the G7, the G20, even the UN Security Council can't even meet and discuss these issues properly because of the tensions between the different countries. But there is also an ideological issue here about what we've assumed to be the way we manage things. And if you look at the assumptions, if you like, BC, before the COVID-19, the balance between risk and security was all wrong in just about every country. We were taking risks and we didn't understand that we were completely unprotected against a pandemic, against poverty and unemployment, which has resulted from it. We assumed a kind of market fundamentalism that suggested that if you just left everything to markets, public bad, private good, then everything would work itself out. And now we're finding that government is not just the lender of last resort, it's the insurer of last resort, it's the provider of last resort. And I think we assumed a sort of narrow, self-interested individualism and didn't understand that a threat that others faced could easily become a threat that we faced. And we could only help ourselves by helping other people at the same time. So there is a sense of having to learn that in the management of this interdependent, interconnected, integrated world, we have to find a better way of working together. So it's not just a failure of individuals, it's a failure to recognize that you've got to go beyond the Washington consensus, beyond the America First nationalism that's gone global, and beyond this idea of one world, two systems. You've got to find a way, even if it's just issue by issue, even if it's just pragmatic, without ideology behind it, you've got to find a way of working together.
Let me ask you a short question and get a short answer from you. You've talked about this, that you've used this term vaccine nationalism. Just define that, and what makes you so scared of this?
Well, I think it was rumored that President Trump had tried to buy up a German vaccine and simply for the use of the United States of America. I mean, everybody, I think, should be clear that while every one of us wants that vaccine to be available to us, our family, our locality, and our country, you cannot eradicate this virus without that vaccine being available to all. And that's why so much is being done by the scientific and the medical community to coordinate efforts to produce this vaccine and then to mass manufacture it, but they need money behind it. You're not going to be able to equitably distribute this vaccine unless you deal with international patent laws, unless you deal with the privileges of particular companies and countries, and unless you deal with the very difficult task of manufacturing the same vaccine in a host of different countries simultaneously, so it's available to everybody at roughly the same time. And that is a problem of international cooperation that really the governments of the world should be facing up to, and not just the scientists and the medics of the world.
Right. Let me ask you in the couple of minutes that we have left, we have a couple of questions from our audience. From Laurie Goering, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from the Thomson Reuters Foundation. How much does the way forward from this crisis, COVID-19 crisis, have to take into account another fast approaching threat, climate change impact?
Absolutely. I mean, each of the problems that I'm identifying that are attached to this crisis are as relevant if you look at the climate change crisis. That the ways we have of governing the world, of making agreements, is not working. So we've got a climate change agreement that's based on a treaty that assumes that everybody has got a will to reach a particular target, but there are no obligations on them to set national targets that do so. They can set their own national targets. There's no ability of us to have an agreement on what targets each country should make and meet that are suitable for the world. So climate change reveals exactly the same kind of problem, that you cannot solve this by a Washington consensus approach or by nationalism or by just China and America getting together. We have to find a better way of working together where we agree on targets that actually become binding on each of us. But you know, when you're talking about the way forward, I'm not trying to suggest that this is the only problem we've got. I mean, the relationship between the individual and the state, between the public and the private sector, between market and society, all these things are going to change as a result of this crisis. The social contract is going to have to be rewritten. It does not fit the needs of the times, particularly when people realize that they're not prepared to risk everything and find themselves either vulnerable to medical diseases or alternatively to poverty and unemployment.
Well, you say it has to be
doing of that.
Will it? But will it be rewritten?
Well, that's the question.
I mean, what do you think right now? I mean, do you think that this is going to be 2 years from now, we're going to look back at this period as a bad blip, and then we're going back to the way things were? Or do you think this is going to cause some?
This is not a global crisis in the ordinary sense. This is a crisis of globalization. This is when we've had a wake-up call that unless we find a way of cooperating better and working together, we will be besieged by problems. Nuclear proliferation. How many more countries are considering proliferating? Climate change, inequality and the poverty, tax havens, and the inability of us to control the loss of money from public exchequers and revenues lost to public services. These are all problems that are coming up to hit us. And unless we find a better way, even if it's just issue by issue of cooperating, we will not be able to do anything other than just struggle along at best and perhaps remain in crisis at worst. Right. Secular stagnation is what we're facing on the economy, but a world that is fragile, a world that is not at peace with itself, is also something that is coming out of this crisis unless we do something about it. So I'm aware that it's a matter of choice, remember. I'm saying we should, and we're going to have to review the relationship between individual and state, the social contract, between public and private sectors. We've got to understand that we can't simply rely on markets for everything anymore. But these are choices that this generation has to make. And I believe that these choices should be before us now. And groups like this discussing these issues can realize that we have to look at the social contract. We've got to look at the role of government, the responsibilities of nation states, and their role in the world. If we don't look at these now, then we'll have failed to do what we should have done after 2009. And I wanted to do was look again at the way we structure our international relations.
Right. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, we thank you very much for joining us. We know that you have to go to a meeting in another part of your house, probably in a couple of minutes. But we wanted to thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks so much.
No, it's good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And now we are going to quickly pivot to Danielle Allen, who is right there.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
How are you? I'd call you Madam Prime Minister, but you're not the Prime Minister yet.
Danielle's good. Thank you. Exactly.
Many of you know Danielle Allen, of course. She is a professor at Harvard, obviously director of the Safra Center for Ethics. She derives most of her spiritual and intellectual fulfillment by writing for The Atlantic, but she also does other in life. And most recently, and a lot of you have read what she's written, she's led a group of experts on what seems to be a pretty influential plan for opening up the U.S. called the Roadmap to Pandemic Resilience. And so we are all very eager to hear about this roadmap. Tell us, try to do it in a minute if you can, because of our tight time frame, but tell us what you advocate doing.
Sure. I'm actually going to start with something the Prime Minister was saying, because the concept of pandemic resilience is exactly what he was getting to. Our globalized world left us vulnerable to a pandemic, and none of our economies had built into them the health capacities that they needed for protection against a pandemic. So in the same way that 2008 showed us vulnerabilities in our financial system, and then we had to correct for that and restructure the economy, exactly the same thing is true now. So the goal should be that by the end of this crisis, we actually have pandemic resilient societies and economies. So as it happens, the near-term solution, the answer to your question, is actually the same thing as the long-term solution. So what's the near-term solution? Partly is what we all already are focused on, a massive surge in health capacity. We've been working on that. We're doing pretty well on that front. But then secondly, the part we're not doing as well on is massively scaling up the capacity to test, contact trace, and provide supported isolation to people so that when they test COVID positive, they can reasonably step out of the workforce for 2 weeks. If they're in a role that doesn't give them paid sick leave, they need financial support, job protection in order to isolate and help reduce rates of transmission. But the goal here is to scale up testing to such a scale that it can actually replace collective quarantine as a tool of disease control. So our report puts out, we've got the highest targets that are out there. We think that we need 5 million tests a day. That's what it would take to bring the transmission rate to 0.75 consistently.
Right, but 5 million tests a day sounds like science fiction, given that we haven't even done 5 million tests in America through the whole, according to the Atlantic's own COVID tracking project, we haven't done 5 million yet.
Yeah.
Where was the failure here? Like what broke down to the degree that we're in this crisis?
So, I think there are a couple of intersecting things in all honesty, and I don't think one can, there are leadership questions. There is the question of the White House and what they sought to do, but there's also questions about how CDC has operated. So there was a mistake in the very, very beginning around testing. And the result of that mistake was that we ended up with an insufficient testing supply. And so CDC put out guidance that tests should only be used for symptomatic people, and really only for the most symptomatic people, people showing up in hospitals. And the moment that the CDC did that, that was a market signal to test producers that there was no market for their tests. And so right from that beginning, we had this massive supply chain problem where nobody was getting a signal that suggested what the demand would appropriately be. So we weren't targeting demand appropriately, so therefore producers didn't have good reason to invest in repurposing equipment or expanding their capacity, and we just fell further and further behind. So at the point that we started falling behind with that original sort of failure of market signaling, it was really important that the federal government step in with something like a war production board, but call it a pandemic testing board, and start working on those supply chain questions. So we're seeing movements in those directions, and that's a good thing. And hopefully we'll be able to build on those. The number is not science fiction, the number is doable. If we could solve the coordination problems of the supply chain, we could get to 2 million a day based on the existing footprint of testing. To get higher than that, we do need to build an innovation pathway for testing. And that's where the sort of breakthrough with saliva test is so important. So about 2 weeks ago, the FDA approved the first saliva test. That is a massive simplification of the testing process because then people can do it for themselves. You don't need another human in PPE sticking a Q-tip up your nose. You yourself can spit into, a test tube. If the test tube has viral deactivator in it, then it's no longer a biohazard. And so all the transport issues that come with getting the samples to labs disappear. So there's a way to simplify the testing process, and then the scale at millions a day is really, it's not science fiction. It's within our range. It's a coordination problem, a supply chain problem. It's not breaking laws of physics.
Right. Let me talk about another qualm that people have about another aspect of what you're talking about, contact tracing. Your friends at the law school are probably talking about this to some degree. At what point do you worry that contact tracing, that app downloads and sort of the government knowing where you are at all times, when does that give you worry about the imposition of privacy violation?
So there's no need for those kinds of tools or that kind of surveillance for effective contact tracing. So that's the important thing to say. So let's back up a step and think about what are the civil liberties issues at stake here. Currently, we have one tool in our toolkit for disease control, for a disease as infectious as this one with the kind of infection fatality rate that this one has. And that tool in our toolkit is collective quarantine, okay? And we've seen that it's profoundly economically devastating. It's important to recognize that collective quarantine is also a massive civil liberties infringement. We've all lost our rights of association, our rights of mobility. So the ideal thing is to replace collective quarantine with targeted isolation of only those people who are positive. So anybody who is negative can be moving around freely and have their rights to associate and so forth with appropriate, wearing masks, social distancing and so forth, but nonetheless get those rights back. So contact tracing is what makes that possible. It's what makes it possible to find positive cases. Every time a person tests positive, find their contacts, test them, and then only put in isolation the people who are COVID positive. And then that is the way you reduce the impact on civil liberties. So what makes contact tracing okay? In the first instance, the bedrock for it is manual contact tracing, all right? And this we've done forever. It's a standard part of public health. It was a hugely important part of the HIV/AIDS crisis. It matters that contact tracers be people who are trusted in the communities where they're working. So this is not about standing up a federal force of contact tracers. This is about activating community organizations and having collaborations between county public health officials and municipal leaders to build up contact tracing personnel. It's also an employment opportunity, an upskilling opportunity into the health service corps for lots of people. And so contact tracers have the job really of working with a COVID positive person to have those conversations about who they've been around in the last couple of weeks that might involve intimate details, and to talk through how you go about alerting your network of friends that they too should get tested. And again, the model is sort of HIV/AIDS. So there is a kind of intimacy element that's involved here. And for that, you really do need in-person human contact tracers. That can be supported with technology, but that technology support, where somebody, for example, say uses a Bluetooth-based app on their phone that can alert other phones they've been near that they should go get tested, does not require sharing that data with the government, okay? So that's the important thing. You don't actually have to share that data with the government in order to run contact tracing.
Right. So let me ask you this. We've talked about this in a slightly different context. There's a strong streak in American life of a libertarian streak of radical individualism, of leave me alone, or however you want to frame it. I'm not seeing, like, maybe in New York City it works, maybe in Boston it works, but I'm not seeing large swaths of the country being necessarily ready to answer invasive, intimate questions about who they've been with over the last couple of weeks and their movements, even from a non-Orwellian, non-machine, non-Big Brother kind of eye in the sky, but just another human representing a government agency. Don't you worry about when you're putting this forward that you're going to meet a level of resistance based on that American ethos of privacy and individualism?
Well, the truth is, I honestly think that a part of contact tracing should also be do-it-yourself contact tracing. I think there's another part of our ethos, which is about the barn raising, the proverbial idea that communities help one another. And frankly, if you've exposed somebody to a highly infectious virus that they could pass on to their grandmother and cause a fatality, I think we have a moral imperative to warn each other. So the real focus is about peer-to-peer sharing of warnings. And I think even individualistic America could understand the moral imperative of peer-to-peer sharing of warnings.
Do you think that we in the media, and the media is not one thing, obviously, but do you think that the country focuses too much on these protesters, give me liberty or give me death, people who might get both at demonstrations? Do you, and you're a very careful watcher of American behavior and American ideological behavior. Do you think that most Americans are actually with the program in a kind of way, understand the seriousness of this and understand the rate of infection has to be brought down radically?
So I think we have a real problem around knowledge and public education, and particularly around things like case rates. So right now we're all sort of tracking, is the case rate number coming down and so forth. But actually those numbers are simply a reflection of the number of tests that we actually have. So we're not, in fact, appropriately informing the American public of the seriousness of the disease, the level of prevalence, footprint. So I think we need to focus on excess deaths, for instance, and really be sharing that data with the American public. So I think that the understanding of how dangerous this disease is still quite uneven, and that there is significant public education that we continue to need to do.
Okay, and that comes to my final question for you, which is about national leadership. I don't quite understand how all of these things that you want to get done will be able to get done when the federal government is led by someone who speculates openly about the injection of disinfectant as a means of curing the disease. I mean, you seem to be up against an immovable object in this sense.
So I think it's really important that we have to activate all parts of our federal system for this. This really is a whole of government responsibility and effort. There is a role for the president and the White House, but the governors need to lead testing programs in their states. And the fact of the matter is, at this point, if the governors set their testing targets high enough and feed that information into the White House, it will drive changes in policy. And so that's really where we need to focus, is making sure governors have the information they need to set the targets that they need and to be really clear about the coordination problems that they have. One of the biggest challenges here is that the CDC is really only inching away from that initial kind of therapeutic picture of testing. They're only inching away from that rather than striding mile by mile to the control picture. And the way to, so now, the White House is kind of caught between these two different pictures and visions. And so we really need the governors to be advocates for that massively scaled up testing program that will permit us to open the economy, keep it open stably, and achieve that sort of pandemic resilient economy that we're trying to talk about.
Right. Prime Minister Allen, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Danielle, good to be here with you.
Good to see you. We'll see you soon.
Take care.
Thanks very much for doing this.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And next in our speed dating afternoon, we are going to welcome, I believe, Dr. Anya, there she is, Agnes Beniguajo. Hi.
Hello, Jeff.
Good to see you. Haven't seen you for a while, and we're reaching you in Kigali. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I'm talking from my home in Kigali.
Wonderful, wonderful. And one of the interesting things, and I should mention that we're talking now with the former health minister of Rwanda, a real global leader in health, and a pediatrician by training originally. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yes. And one of the interesting things about where you are in Kigali is that Rwanda has really put a lid on spread of this virus, unlike where I'm sitting in Washington. And obviously people are incredibly interested to know what the secret is of Rwanda's success. It's all provisional success, things could always go badly, but so far, at least, Rwanda has got a handle on this. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on there that maybe we haven't seen in the United States?
You are right. So far, we have in Rwanda only 201 confirmed cases of COVID-19. 93 have already recovered. 114 are still active cases. And so far, we have no deaths. And we have made it in Rwanda by using evidence-based approach backed by science, learning from our past effort to prevent Ebola, but also from success and failures of the pandemic response across the world, because we know that the global response will be as strong as the weakest country, and the pandemic are just outbreaks mishandled. We need to use the expertise that exists all over the world and to learn how to share it quickly on time. We know also that the vulnerable are the most affected both by diseases and prevention measures. Even in rich countries like your country, for example, in New York, where the virus is killing Black and Latino people at twice the rate as white people. It's not a racial weaknesses. These people are vulnerable because the condition where they live. And against that, the society could act. It will be better for all. And because of this knowledge in Rwanda, we continue to apply two pillars of our health policies, an equity approach and a multi-sectorial approach. This means solidarity and decentralization. Strict isolation, for example, protect all and can only work if all have enough food for their family, which is hard when you no longer have an income because of the lockdown. The central government and the local government then have to organize distribution of food and social support for people. So the Rwandan success is proof that you don't need to be rich or have large scale of resources to successfully prevent the spread of coronavirus. You just need to take the time to provide simple and accurate information to the nation, to fight misinformation from inside the country or outside the country, to take evidence-based decisions backed by science and on time, and to develop trust, solidarity, and social support. This is what we teach at the University of Global Health Equity.
Right. Talk about that a little bit more. The government communications program. I'm very curious about that. Literally, how often does the government communicate with people? What is the level of scientific technical qualities of that communication? Give us a more complete picture of how that communication is going. I'm asking for an obvious reason, which is that we have in America right now an idiosyncratic approach to the dissemination of information from the highest level of the federal government.
So in Rwanda, our president just come and give us the high level of line or where we stand with other countries, etc. Regularly, there was a great press conference yesterday. Every day, the Minister of Health issue the number of people infected who have recovered and new cases and the number of tests that has been done during the day, and also where the new cases are coming from. Now, what we have as level of information, I think that the world understand that what is a virus, we discuss, because we have other virus, so we build on previous knowledge, but also what we do, and probably what is quite unique to our country, is that in the preparation, and we were prepared early January. We start preparing and testing everybody at the airport mid-January, 1 month before the first cases. The first cases in this country was the 14th of March. And everything was ready to be rolled out at the minute of the first test positive. The people who test know who to announce it, and etc. So that means at the moment, the Minister of Health issue a communique. At that moment, all schools, churches were locked down. And because the preparation was done with all churches, They had airtime on TV and radio for their office, for each religion of the country, and all the head of religion were part of the discussion before. So everything rolled out smoothly. The media were also informed about what is the disease, what can happen, what will be done if the country was affected by the pandemic, etc. So the parliament, the media, the local government, the civil society, the private sector, everybody was briefed before, with the role of each and every constituency well established and everybody knowing what the others are going to do. So this is the level of information.
Well, let me ask you this question about Rwanda. Rwanda is many things, and the government is generally considered to be extraordinarily competent. But Rwanda is not a democracy, does not have the same democratic traditions as the United States, the UK, for instance. Does it help that Rwanda doesn't have, that the people of Rwanda don't have the same democratic rights as other peoples? Does it help that the government is more all-encompassing in its power?
Okay, let me rephrase your question like I would like to be asked.
And then I'll ask the way I just did, but go ahead.
So, first of all, I'm raising against what you say. We are a democracy, meaning everybody vote. And if you go in all, not now because there is a lockdown, go and ask who didn't express his desire to have the president we have and his desire for him to stay, and why, and we know why. Now, the democracy you have, I'm so sorry. For me, if I found my country more democratic than yours, because you have a country where Black people like me have problem to vote when they don't fight for it, where people are mistreated and killed every day without more than we have in my country. What you should reflect on, what is the definition of a democracy? Where your democracy has been hijacked through emails and Facebook. So I want you to be a little bit less arrogant on the definition of what democracy means and leave the Rwandan the choice that they have done. So,
well,
I agree with you. I agree with you that we have a strong government, cohesive government, working like one. And also this help because you are so disorganized. And when I say that we need to avoid misinformation, we need to have a common language to talk to the nation and to protect the nation, you didn't reach that. And maybe this is something you miss.
I'm more than happy to talk about, and I have been talking about, the failures of the American government response to this crisis. It doesn't absolve the Rwandan government, and obviously, I don't think that that Rwandan dissidents and media representatives are being arrogant when they criticize aspects of the way Rwanda is governed. And my question is, because this goes to a larger question, there is this debate about whether democracies are better equipped for handling a pandemic or more authoritarian style countries. And you might have a view on that. I'm pretty sure that we've done this before. I'm pretty sure that we're not going to come to a meeting of minds on this. I will give you another opportunity to talk about it if you want. But yeah. I'm also interested in asking you about the World Health Organization, because you are a senior.
To come back to your previous question, Jeff, I just want to tell you that in my country, if somebody go and give information to people that can harm them or kill them or put them in danger, you face the law and you are accountable to that. Maybe this is also something different.
No. And that I understand. That is based in the very special and tragic history, recent history of Rwanda as well, where your country had an let's call it a relatively early experience in mass disinformation and the consequences of the perpetuation of mass disinformation. I totally see that point. Let me ask you about the World Health Organization. You're a senior advisor to the Director General. President Trump has cut off funding to the World Health Organization, saying that they covered up, they're incompetent and covered up what was going on in China. Without agreeing with Donald Trump, would you agree that with some of the criticism of the World Health Organization, that it was too soft or too slow on the question of what was going on in China at the time?
I think no, I disagree, because a pandemic as a definition, all countries can come together again as the General Assembly of the World Health Organization are the Minister of Health of all countries and redefine what pandemic is, but they didn't delay. And how come that the countries who are really hit badly by the virus had the same information than countries that did well? So I think it's the way the information are used, the information given by the World Health Organization is used by the country, and the way the government are listened to the scientific inside and outside the country, that make the difference.
Let me ask you one other question about your relations with the United States. And I asked Prime Minister Brown this a little while ago. The world is used to American leadership. My question to you is the world going to be would the world be a better place if America weren't looked to for leadership? Or now that the world is not looking to America for leadership, is that actually making the global effort more difficult? I guess I'm asking you to sort of place America now on a spectrum of global leadership.
So we all know that in the way forward, in the future, the balance will not be the same. What it will be exactly, I don't have a strong idea on that. But the role that the government of your country have played now, like if you go out of WHO, you can go out of WHO. WHO will survive and continue to advise people. You just roll back from a leadership position you could have. So this will change, yes. And the rest is, for me, I don't mix the government, your government, and the people of the US, because my best friend are in your country. The best brain I know are shared globally, but you have everything you need. It's just not used for the moment.
Right. Are we talking about Paul Farmer, perhaps?
We talk about Paul Farmer, but we could talk also about the thousands of great minds you have in the National Academy of Science. I talk about all your universities so well staffed by great brains that are underused because the science is not on the front of the decision taken in your country today.
Right. One final question for you. You're the Vice Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity, great institution. And I want to focus on the last word of the title, equity. Do you think that this pandemic is going to lead to more nationalization, what Gordon Brown refers to as vaccine nationalism, for instance? Or do you think that this might trigger a different kind of global conversation about what equity means? About resources that are provided to sub-Saharan Africa, say, versus the United States or Europe. Do you think that we're at a pivot point, or do you think we might just go back to the way things are or were?
This will be the choice we will make in a couple of months when the world will wake up from this pandemic. This pandemic has shown us that without solidarity, without caring for the vulnerable, you just delay the good response of all the means you put to fight the pandemic. When I told you that what we do here work only because the vulnerable who doesn't have enough food on daily basis are cared of by the central and the local government. This is what we call equity. The future will not redefine what equity is. In the future, the world will decide what they are ready to spend on equity or not. And if we go back to the former status of the world, we are going to lose a lot, because this is just a warning. We are going to have many more outbreaks that will be mishandled, turned in pandemic. And if we don't count on solidarity inside your community, like inside your family, inside the country, inside the region, the reaction will be even worse. We need to develop solidarity and trust.
On that heavy note. It's an important point to make. I want to say thank you very much. Always fun talking to you and arguing with you, Agnes. Dr. Agnes Binagwaho, one of the leading forces in global health, and we're very, very glad to have had you. Thanks so much for coming.
And Jeff, thank you. You are among the great brain in this part of the world.
That's what my wife always says. Yeah, that's what my yes. All right, bye-bye. And finally, as we move through this roster of experts, let me welcome Dr. Arvind Subramanian, who's going to join us. I don't know if he's there yet. Are we there?
Hi, Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So technically, we've actually managed this so far. It's pretty impressive. You've been listening to this conversation.
Yeah.
Dr. Subramanian. Let me just introduce you very quickly. I'm sorry. You were, until recently, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India from 2014. I think you left in 2018. Is that correct? And now you're a fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm finding you in Cambridge. You're also working at the Kennedy School. Is that correct? You know, let's stay on this point that Dr. Binagwaho was making about America and its brains and its talent. Because you're here, you're currently not in India. You're affiliated with two august institutions of research and reason. What's the disconnect from your analysis as a semi-outsider? What's the disconnect between the wealth of information that Americans have? Peterson Institute providing great information, obviously. Kennedy School filled with very, very smart people. You're in Cambridge. Danielle Allen is there. Everybody's there. What's the disconnect? Why haven't we incorporated scientific thinking as much as we should have in the early response to what happened?
You know, I think, Jeff, at one simplistic level, you know, obviously you want to say this is an out consequence of the leadership that you have, and you know we can have that discussion forever and ever. But I guess it kind of speaks to the kind of deeper problem that America faces, right? That you know it's more that something about the polarization that's happened over the last many years in the U.S. That's led to this complete kind of different, universes where if there isn't basic agreement on the facts, on the science, on basic rules of organization, it is going to manifest itself in political dysfunction. So I think it would help us better to kind of not see this merely as a problem of kind of political leadership, which can change, hopefully, over time, but as something, a kind of political dysfunction that stems from something deeper about, what's been happening in the U.S. over a long time. The inequality, the polarization, and all of that. And I'm not the expert on that, but it does seem, to be something more than just, bad transient leadership.
Right. Do you? We can come back to this in a minute. It's an important subject also about elites and their cures for people who sometimes don't want to take the cures that the elites are handing out. But let's talk about an area of your expertise. One of the questions that's on people's minds is, what is this going to cost? What is it going to cost the United States? What is it going to cost in the UK? What is it going to cost globally? My question to you, as an expert on the IMF, on banking, on the World Bank, my question is this: what will it cost to get the pandemic under global control? And does the world currently have the will, the collective governments of the world have the will to actually spend what it will take to bring this to a manageable level by the fall of this year?
Yeah, see, I think as Prime Minister Brown said, at the national level, many countries are acting very decisively. The failures at the international level, which is a different way of saying basically that developing countries will not have the resources that they need, because the advanced countries, they can print money, they can issue debt, they have the money. So when we talk about the lack of coordination and the ability inability to generate resources at the international level, we're really saying that there are lots of poor countries out there who will not have enough resources to combat the health dimension and then the economic dimension. So these are, I think I've not actually costed the amounts, but clearly, at least on the economic side, we know that Gordon Brown's number was 2.5 trillion. But the fact is, we're not even remotely close to coming up with anything like that amount. So we might, it strikes me as, the exhortations to cooperation seem to me as useless as, not appreciating how exactly at the moment we need this leadership is when I think we're kind of almost functionally are unable to provide it and will continue to be so for a very long time. I talk about, we talk about a G0 world, so it's not just, no leadership. I actually think we're in a G-2 world where, the major powers, the US, China, to some extent Europe, not just are they not providing global public goods, they're actually providing global public bads. So if this is, if this is the kind of context for cooperation, the kind of background reality for cooperation, you can exhort whatever you want and, call for more and more sums of money. Look at actually what happened at the IMF meetings this time. You got a little bit of, moratorium on debt, but we got nowhere close to the resources that we need. And moreover, the point that Gordon didn't make was that even the money that's available, the big difference between the national and international is in the national, unconditional, whatever it takes. But the international level, it still comes with strings. And so it's not just quantities, but also conditionality, tied aid, and all of that. So I think we're really very, very far away from, we're not even close to the kind of cooperation that we need to address either the health dimension or the economic dimension.
So let me stay on this question of leadership, because I'm interested in how much you think this is a question about the quality of individuals or the durability, sometimes the malevolent durability of systems, of global finance, for instance. What I hear you saying is that you think a better set of quality leaders would have made a material difference over the past 3 months. Is that fair?
In this instance, I think it might have made a difference. Yes, I think so. Yes.
Yeah. Would you talk about? Go on. Go. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think because, for example, on the SDR issues, IMF generating more resources, it seems like there were very few countries that almost all the world was behind it. And but for a few, leaders and countries, we might have got a little bit more. The other, of course, structural problem is, part of the G-2 world also, Jeff, is that, it's the whole US-China relationship, which doesn't necessarily, it's not just a matter of leaders, is a matter of, the whole rising power versus the status quo power, how they handle that. So that's kind of a more structural, deeper thing as well, which is over and above whatever happens due to,
Right.
weak leadership.
Well, stay on that for a minute and talk about whether let's say in the zero-sum sweepstakes between China and the US, neither party, neither government has exactly covered itself in glory over the past couple of months. But do you think that China has really lost a step here? Or do you think that the US response to its own pandemic problems has cost it a level of credibility that otherwise it wouldn't have lost?
I think actually both have happened. I think both the US response has, led to a lot of loss of credibility, and the kind of Chinese response, both initially in terms of what happened in terms of, the outbreak of the crisis and how much information was or wasn't shared, and the fact and the cover-up. My own sense is that, I think there are two kind of parallel things happening both in the US and China. My sense is that both are weakened internally. US because of what we've discussed about. China, I think basically that social contract internally between citizens trading off their liberty and freedom for more order and prosperity, I think that's kind of, it's looking wobblier than it used to, one. And second, you think about also the fact that, China's international role via the Belt and Road Initiative, all of those things, that's now also has to be reassessed because, it's been lending on onerous terms, its clients are now weak, they probably can't repay. And so the whole Chinese gambit at soft power, so not just internally, but its gambit at soft power is also going to be weakened. And as a result, this G-2 world is really going to come in the way of, a cooperation going forward.
Right. It is an interesting moment, right? Because China, most of the countries that ring China would rather be in a strong alliance with the United States than with China for a set of obvious reasons, from Vietnam to, well, draw a circle. But the United States, at least in this current iteration of American leadership, just seems uninterested in capitalizing on that. And I wonder if you have specific thoughts about the opportunities lost in that sense. Then we'll come to India in a second, but I want to just stay on that for 1 minute.
Yeah, of course, it's an opportunity lost. I think that, but the problem, of course, Jeff, I think we have to be careful here, because if you think about it as a status quo power, I think the attitude toward China is more bipartisan than I think we're willing to accept in the United States as well. So it's not just a kind of erratic leadership, missing opportunities. It's as much, structurally, how does a rising power cope with a status quo power, cope with a rising power that is very different, that has, does things in, slightly, sometimes strange ways, sometimes acceptable ways. So I think it's that bigger systemic kind of structural power transformation thing, which I think, because this is going to survive after November as well. These set of issues aren't going to go away. One thing we haven't spoken about, of course, in all this is in the global response, how countries are closing trade and actually making the problem worse for each other. Medical supplies, food. Part of what was good about globalization was that yes, the pandemics were global, but the ability to respond is also global. And we're foregoing all those opportunities in terms of getting medical equipment. In sub-Saharan Africa, many countries are net food importers. If countries are going to choke off their exports of foods, this is going to make the problem even worse.
Well, let's end here on this biggest question, sort of where we started an hour ago, on globalization. Is this going to turn into a profoundly anti-globalization moment? Or is there going to be a refinement of what globalization means? Or are people going to recognize the inevitability of interdependence after this pandemic?
I think, Jeff, I'm a little bit more
in the predict the entire future of the world, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Obviously, I'm more pessimistic for three reasons. I think the world is going to reevaluate its reliance on China for a number of things, including things like, pharmaceuticals, essential things and so on. So I think that's going to happen. In my own country, India has imposed, kind of restrictions on Chinese FDI into India. So I think that's going to be, there's going to be kind of broader deglobalization, but some of it targeted at China in particular. So that I think is the second thing I worry about a lot, which we haven't seen as yet, is the movement of people. I think if you look at the Gulf, for example, the number of migrants that are stuck in that, and what's going to happen to them when they go back. The immigrants in the US, you've seen what the administration has done in terms of visas and so on. So I think the movement of people, a little bit more self-reliance, at least on critical commodities, I think these are going to change. And of course, I think the whole Chinese foreign direct investment, I think we've always had this national security concern, but I suspect it might spread beyond that. So I'm more on the skeptical, on the pessimistic side. I'm not saying that's desirable, but I suspect we might well evolve in that direction.
Well, we'll have you back again, and maybe you'll be slightly more optimistic by then. I don't know, but we'll have to see. But I want to thank you very much, Arvind Subramanian. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today for this first experiment. Let me thank my colleagues at the Atlantic for all their hard work in pulling this together. I want to recognize Chatham House, the Peterson Institute, and of course the Emerson Collective for this new initiative, and to stay up to date on the latest information and insights about coronavirus. It's not like I'm reading or anything propaganda for The Atlantic, but I am. You should actually visit theatlantic.com. We have great coverage of all aspects of this crisis, and our coverage is free and in front of the paywall. We've done that as obviously a public service, as many others have done. But of course, we do hope that you subscribe. I personally think it's worth subscribing. But again, let me thank all of our partners in this, and thank you again to our audience and our guests for joining us. Thanks very much.